Alrighty, so as I said, this week we're talking about animals that are usually considered pests or that can be considered as pests. And so we've got some really interesting examples this week around, especially around cats and kangaroos. And both of these animals sort of operate in this really interesting grey area where whether they're considered a pest or not really depends on some vexed issues around context, around ideas of ownership, I suppose, and also some broader ideas around ethics in terms of and especially I'm thinking of kangaroos, where we've got these complex cultural ideas about what a kangaroo is, what it represents, its connection to our identity as Australians. There's also a deep sort of cultural and symbolic significance to First Nations people. So this idea of animals as pests is actually quite a complex one, which is really interesting. But I thought I'd quickly open the discussion up, unbound by this week's tutorial questions, to just sort of get some of your reactions to these ideas broadly around animals as pests, and some of the issues that you might have thought of, or that might have sort of been thrown up for you as you engaged with the content from this week. What did you think broadly about this topic? Well, I guess if there are thoughts as we go through, feel free to jump in at any time. But otherwise, we might as well dive straight into the hypothetical or the tutorial questions for this week. And so the first one looks at cats and this broad idea of feral cats, which itself, is not necessarily a straightforward or uncontested term. But then beyond that, what's the impact that they have on wildlife and other animals, and what should we do about it? And so the key question, there's a few readings for you to have gone through, but then the key question being around Sarah Legg and colleagues' article and Sophie Riley and colleagues' article, and thinking about, what are the differences in perspective in these two articles, and thinking about, which argument do you think is stronger, and why? So let's sort of start off thinking about the differences between the two, and I suppose points of similarity as well. What were your takeaways from those two readings?
I sort of thought that it's not as a straightforward issue as what I first thought, really. Not that I've put that much thought into feral cats, but that I think an interesting point that both articles made was that the issue isn't just about cats. If we're saying that the problem isn't the cats themselves, the problem is the damage to other wildlife and native wildlife and that sort of thing, then I think the point that both articles make that's really important is that feral cats is just one tiny little part of a bigger picture of so many more issues.
Yep, absolutely. So sort of thinking about points of commonality between the article. I may have just frozen there for a minute, so I'll backtrack. Thinking about points of commonality between the two articles, there's this recognition that cats, I suppose, broadly pose a risk to native wildlife. Certainly, feral cats is part of that problem, but they both agree that cats more generally pose a risk to wildlife. Yeah, absolutely. What else?
I guess also the idea that just culling cats isn't going to necessarily make much difference with population regrowth and all the other issues, climate change, environmental degradation, and land clearing, and all sorts of stuff, different issues that are affecting wildlife and native animals. That, yeah, just killing cats isn't going to
absolutely. So
fix everything.
that's sort of one of the key points that Riley, the Riley article makes, is that the culling is as part of, or as a key part of, the solution. They are suggesting that that's not really a very effective strategy. What does Leg say about that? What's their, and you know, I don't think it's quite as explicitly made. I think they're very careful to actually not necessarily mention culling per se, but what do they think of the sort of trap neuter release strategy, which is you know, might be thought of as an alternative to culling?
Well, they say that those programs aren't effective at reducing populations of feral cats, but they don't cite any research on that.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I sort of, my takeaway, there were sort of two parts to it. There was the first in terms of what does it actually do as a matter of population control, but sort of even more than that, the perspective is, you know, even if you know, that particular cat isn't breeding and making more cats, posing more of a risk, there's still at least that cat out and about posing a risk to wildlife and all of that, and that is seen as a problem, right? So it's you know, you could do everything you could to make sure that the cat doesn't breed. It's still going to be a cat out in the wild killing native wildlife, and as far as Leg's concerned, that's, you know, if not an unacceptable situation, certainly an undesirable one. And you know, that's a really key tension between the two articles. Then is this sort of approach on trap neuter release, but more broadly, sort of, you know, what do we do about the issue of a cat in out and about killing wildlife? So that sort of, I think that's a surface level point of difference. I'm interested to know what you think then about what that says in terms of a deeper perspective, or a deeper point of tension between these two articles. And I think what's really going on here, and what's interesting, is that Leg quite clearly has the perspective that wildlife is more valuable or more worthy of protection than cats. You know, there's a hierarchy sort of at play. And for leg, the calculation is that wildlife wins. And so where a cat poses a threat or is problematic to wildlife, then the interests of the wildlife prevail over the interests of the cat. And that's why, the trap, neuter, release strategy is not acceptable to leg, is because there is still the cat out and about, posing a danger to wildlife. We can contrast that with Riley, and the authors in that article seem to, I think they fall short of making the argument that, all creatures are equal and should be equally protected, but there's certainly closer inequality, and the interests of the cat and the humane treatment of the cat is certainly given a lot more weight than it seems to be given in the leg article. And I think that's the key difference in perspective. That's the key tension between these two articles, and that then influences their ideas around the strategies for dealing with the problems that cats, and especially feral cats, pose. That's my perspective. That's my interpretation. I'm interested to know whether you think that's a fair characterization of the articles, whether you sort of took something different away from those readings.
I mean, in the leg article, she there's opposition to other things as well. Like, they don't think the curfews are possibly going to be effective because there's still cats out through the day, killing wildlife and stuff like that. So there's a few different things in there that they're opposed to, as opposed to the Riley one that seemed to be a very line. Whatever Leg said was not going to work, Riley would say it's more than likely going to work. And so there was definitely a disparity in their ideas.
Yep.
That was really quite obvious.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and thinking about sort of in terms of, they both agree that cats pose a threat to native wildlife, as we've said. But then, from that position, they have very different ideas about what to do about it. And Legs, this is an oversimplification, but Legs' position seems to be, you can have a cat, but keep it indoors and never let it out. Whereas Riley, takes more of an approach around really interesting ideas around sort of a more human-centric approach, I would say, in terms of educating people and owners and encouraging them to ensure that their cat is not causing damage to wildlife and things like that. It's a really interesting difference in approach. In the chat, Kat has mentioned it didn't address the issues of taking cats out of the bush and outback, and the mouse plagues. You rid one and increase another that's more destructive. So thinking about what cats do in the wild as predators to other invasive species. So it's not just as simple as taking feral cats out of the equation, even if you could, because there are issues with other introduced species as well, which is a really interesting perspective. And Rachel has followed that up as well. Non-native species are often exterminated, for example, myxomatosis released on European rabbits. So there's interesting, and I'm interested in your thoughts, I suppose, then about what this sort of says more broadly about the debate, and one of the sort of arguments that seems to be implicit, especially in Legg's article, about the tension between, I suppose, the interests of native Australian wildlife versus the interests of introduced species like cats as the focus of these articles, but mice, rabbits, other creatures as well. I'm interested in if anyone's got any thoughts on that particular tension, or the way that we kind of make those value judgments, I suppose, between species. Does anyone, and it's okay if you don't have an opinion, but yeah, I'm interested to see if anyone wants to sort of go out on a limb and say that, yes, of course, 100%, native Australian wildlife is more valuable or more worthy of protection than feral introduced species, or the opposite. You might think that they're all creatures at the end of the day. They're all worthy of and valuable and deserve protection. I'm interested if there's sort of any ideas around that kind of tension.
I feel like rather than whether they're an introduced species or a native species, I think it's more about protecting the species that are threatened or endangered, and we would, if it wasn't feral cats and it was something else, maybe a natural, I'm not sure, but another thing that was threatening them, I think that we would try and control it. I would hope the best we can to try and keep the species going. So rather than a native or an introduced, I think it's more just about protecting whichever is in danger.
Okay, yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. So yeah, it's not native versus introduced. It's threatened versus, I suppose, thriving or abundant. We might circle back to that idea when we talk about kangaroos then, because I think that adds an interesting element to that debate for sure. I'll catch up on the chat. So there's a discussion going on about, so the initial point being in the articles why there's no consideration of reducing feral cat numbers by stopping people from dumping domestic cats. In urban areas, most feral cats start as pets. It's a tricky thing, right, from an enforcement perspective, if nothing else. And there's some discussion in the chat about attempts to control this issue with fines for roaming cats and increasing those fines for cats being out at night and imposing curfews and things like that. But it's a tricky thing. For one, as I said, tricky to enforce, and for two, as Legg kind of points out, is that even during the day, cats can pose a threat to wildlife and things like that. So it's a tricky thing. So then thinking, I'm just sort of contextualizing Rachel's comment, doesn't apply in the case of kangaroos threatening cattle and sheep enterprises, essentially due to the extreme competition for feed when numbers are up in drought. So I think that's relating to this idea of native versus introduced, or threatened versus non-threatened. It's a tricky thing. It's an interesting sort of tension for sure. So some interesting perspectives, and I think what's really valuable for our purposes is to think about what this kind of tension says about the way that we think about these animals, and the way that especially the Riley reading talks about this, I don't want to say human-centric, but the way that ownership ties into this debate as well, right? The distinction between owned cats versus unowned cats, and the distinction between domestic, stray, and feral being, you know, of regulatory significance, even if it's not necessarily a distinction that's meaningful in terms of the threat to native wildlife that an individual cat poses. So yeah, these kind of you know, more human level, I suppose, concepts and issues that we've been talking about around, you know, property and ownership playing out again in another sort of novel context, which is really cool. Any other sort of thoughts on this question before we move on to the next one?
I found it really interesting how you were just talking about the restricted matter and the other one's the biosecurity and the owned cats and unowned cats, because is there a difference between the stray and the feral, because there's that prohibition of feeding and taking care of or providing care to a restricted matter. So is that's feral and stray?
Well, that's sort of the point that the article makes, is that it's not consistent across jurisdictions, and that's part of their concern, is that it's, for one, there's a question about whether it is itself a meaningful distinction in the first place, and the view that they kind of put forward is you know, it seems a little bit more like you know, a matter of semantics that justifies treatment towards a cat that is unowned, that wouldn't be accepted if it were done to a cat that does have an owner. And then, yeah, the way that filters into, you know, that's the fundamental problem. But then on top of that, there's this issue that it's not even consistent across the states as well, that they take issue with as well, which is really interesting. So yeah, it's definitely a point that they see as in need of, you know, better coordination between the states as a first step towards kind of addressing these issues as well, I think, which is really cool.
Because it was interesting how they said if that's the case and it does apply to stray cats as well, then that means that they can't do the trap, neuter, release, because that would be considered like for stray cats, for example, because that would be considered offering them care. So, and that would, if that definition stands, be prohibited.
So yeah, so it's interesting that they add those. The point that they're making is, yeah, the way that these labels, which are not completely artificial, but sort of don't necessarily reflect really what's going on underneath, the way that those, scale up and impact the different ways in which the categories are treated. And yeah, I would think that a change to the definitions and the understanding would need to be accompanied with, a revisiting of what is or isn't allowed for, you know, owned versus unowned, as opposed to domestic, stray, feral, definitely. Some interesting points in the chat as well around some interesting stats here. So 96% of lost dogs are collected, while only 17% of impounded cats are collected. That's a really interesting, differential, and sort of highlights the scope of the issue here. And yeah, some of the I suppose threats or dangers that cats can pose to wildlife. Rachel pointing out that feral cats can carry diseases, including zoonotic parasites. So it's you know, the hunting element is obviously key, but it's broader than that as well. As, you know, introduced disease and stuff too, which is problematic. So yeah, it's a really interesting issue, and one that touches on kind of a range of sub issues as well, which is really cool. We might move along. Question 2 is a pretty brief one. Mrs. Possum is coming to you for advice. She's president of the Australian Furry Animals Advocacy Group. Several of her group's members are of the following species: red kangaroo, eastern grey kangaroo, and the common wallaroo. She would like to confirm the conservation status of each of these 3 species along 3 kind of dimensions. So the IUCN Red List, the Epbca, and the Queensland NCA. So we can deal with this one reasonably straightforwardly. And, you know, as much as anything, I think it's just a useful exercise in practicing identifying different animals and using these various lists and regulations to check the status of different animals. So did we want to sort of quickly talk about the IUCN Red List for each of these animals? What's sort of the status of all 3 of them, really, because they're all the same? Least concern, absolutely. So, you know, these are animals that are not not in serious danger. One thing that's worth noting is that the common wallaroo, which is the focus of this hypothetical, is at least concern, but the black wallaroo is listed as near threatened. So, you know, in terms of answering sort of hypothetical questions and using these kind of lists, especially thinking perhaps in terms of an exam scenario, and, you know, that's not a hint. I don't know that you're going to be asked to do something like that on the exam, but if you were, practicing being able to link up the sort of Latin or scientific name as well is quite key, because in this instance we're sort of just given wallaroo, but it's the scientific name that points us to this really referring to the common wallaroo. And that's a useful distinction here, because yeah, there is this difference between the common wallaroo, which is of least concern, but other types of wallaroo, such as the black wallaroo, have a different status. So just a useful practice in really differentiating between these different types of animals when you're using these lists. What about the Epbca? Any issues relating to these animals there? So I think the key thing to think about here is that they're not listed, so there's sort of no problem with any of them, but it is sort of useful to think about, you know, the Epbca being a key part of the government's implementation of CITES and the trade regulations, sort of as a means of adopting those sort of ideas and legal principles. So there are restrictions around trade and requirements to comply with from that perspective. But in terms of the actual sort of conservation status, no issues identified again for any of these three animals. What about the Nature Conservation Act? Again, it's a similar story, right? They're not listed in the schedule, in the regulations, so we can identify this as being, not a problem. They're not in those sort of key categories that we looked at last week in terms of being endangered or extinct or anything like that. So from a numbers perspective, these are not groups or species that we're particularly worried or concerned about. We'll I think that's useful context as well then to move into question 3, which thinks, I suppose, more broadly about the health and well-being of kangaroos, but also the broader debate around the management of kangaroo populations in New South Wales is the key focus of this report, but the issues are reasonably generalizable to broader Australia as well. So the key task from this question is to think a bit more broadly or reflectively, I suppose, about the kinds of topics that we've considered generally in the unit, but think really clearly about, is there a need to cull kangaroos? What are the different perspectives on how we manage kangaroo populations, and what are some of the issues that these ideas kind of throw up and raise that strike you as being interesting or relevant? And the key thing that I'll emphasize from the question as well is that there's no right answer to these questions. It's an issue that is multifaceted and that does have some pretty deep and divides that are difficult to reconcile, if not impossible. So this is certainly a question where there can be a healthy debate rather than a clear answer.
I guess it kind of relates to the question you were asking before about, I guess, how we value native animals sort of above animals to us as pests. But then, you have an issue like kangaroos, and that it can't be, animals can't be separated so easily into categories of native animals versus pests when they can be both at the same time. So I think it's a I don't know, it's a difficult issue.
It's a tricky, they're sort of where the sort of the cat, the I suppose challenge with addressing cats, you've got cats and wildlife as complete separate circles in sort of a Venn diagram, whereas if you think about the Venn diagram overlapping, and kangaroos are in that overlap where they're native wildlife, but they also can sort of stray over into that sort of pest side of things, and that does put them in a difficult position, or a more difficult position in this debate. Absolutely. What are some other thoughts?
One of the thoughts I had was that I was reading through the SLOS case again today, and one of the comments that the judge made was that it was a case of, what happened was due to need rather than greed. And I think that's probably true here too, because a lot of the animals that need or, get culled, they then turn around and, turn them into exports for, shoes, handbags, food, all sorts of things. And a lot of people don't like that, but I guess the other side of the coin is that if they're not used in those areas, then they would be wasted. They're just laying on the ground and dead. And so there is a bit of tension between that, the use of the products from the animals that are culled. And I mean, there's a lot of culling that goes on. I mean, there's horses, camels, feral pigs, your cats, foxes. There's a lot of it going on. And yeah, even your cattle, there's a lot of feral cattle up in the top end as well. I don't know if people have been watching that show on the ABC recently, where they're basically just harvesting, wild cattle that are up there, and the buffaloes as well. But yeah, a lot of people don't like to see the products used, but at the same token, especially the horses and camels and things like that, it just seems like such a waste to just kill them and leave them on the ground, and all the diseases and things like that would cause.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. I'll follow up. I'll ask a follow-up question if that's all right. Why do you think it is that people do have are concerned about the use of these kind of culled animals for meat, fur, etc., etc.? I think you've outlined that there's a lot to be said for it. Why do you think that people might have a problem with it?
I think it's mainly because they think that they're exploited, firstly, and also that they believe that they're being inhumanely treated. And I mean, certainly there are circumstances where animals, have been, of course. We've all seen Four Corners and things like that, and some of the things that happen in the live export trade and things like that. But so I can understand that, but I mean, the alternative is to leave them, rotting on the ground. And so like I said, I went back to the SLOS case and had a look that it was a matter of, need. If you need to cull something, it's better that its life has a purpose and that it's something useful is done with it, not just, not a greed sort of situation, but, using the resource and not just, killing it. But yeah, I do understand that people don't like it, but I guess there's lots of realities in life we don't like.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting sort of secondary debate, I suppose. If the core or the key debate is, should we be culling kangaroos as part of population management and everything, that's sort of the main issue. But then if we, as a secondary issue, it's like, okay, what do we do with the culled animals? Is it more I suppose respectful to do something productive with the animal, or should it be, is that exploitative and taking things too far? It's an interesting sort of follow-up issue that makes the whole thing even more complex. I'm interested in other thoughts as well about the key debate, but also the secondary debates that arise as well.
Do you think that people might be a little bit against that sort of thing purely just because it's the kangaroo and it has this, it's the cuddly kangaroo, it represents Australia, and and they think that it shouldn't be? I wonder if there is as much debate from society about stuffing cane toads and putting cobra hats on them and stuff, or snake skin or something. I wonder whether it's our perception of the kangaroo and what it represents that possibly causes people to have some pretty strong opinions about it being used for those sorts of purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. So the symbolism and cultural significance of the kangaroo does sort of not only raise the stakes in the debate, but actually, influences people's perceptions of the debate and where sort of the preferred pathway is. And yeah, even I suppose the aesthetics of it, right? So, you sort of mentioned kangaroos being, cute and cuddly and there's an element of, this is a cute creature and we'll protect it versus, something that is a bit more, not as easy to love, let's say, and the way that factors into the debate too. Yeah, we can't ignore that, the sort of the aesthetic element too, I would say. Is it Qantas's fault? Probably not their fault, but I think it certainly does sort of play into as well. It really reinforces that probably more than any other animal, the kangaroo kind of represents Australia. I'd say koala's probably up there as well, but certainly in an official capacity, I think the kangaroo kind of takes the cake. And so, yeah, the symbolism of the kangaroo is really critical to and is an important factor in this debate for sure. Absolutely. Which I think, and I'm sort of spitballing a little bit here, but in terms of thinking about the issues that we talked about earlier in terms of, I suppose, owned versus unowned animals, I'm interested in your reactions to this idea that the cultural significance of kangaroos gives people a, I suppose, sense of ownership towards kangaroos that they wouldn't necessarily have towards other animals as well, or not as strongly towards other wild animals. Obviously, they not owned in the legal sense, but there's a sort of a cultural ownership of the kangaroo as a symbol, and so it's not just the kangaroo as a symbol and what it represents, and therefore what kind of culling does to that sense of national image, but it's a sense of, I suppose, cultural ownership of the kangaroo, and therefore it because of that has a bit different status compared to other animals. I'm interested if you think that that's I suppose a fair perspective, or whether I'm sort of way off base in that interpretation.
I think that's fair. I think that makes sense. And even like in study guide, there was talk about being on the coat of arms and being, and like I grew up with Skippy, and probably too old for everyone else doesn't remember the TV show Skippy with the kangaroo, but it has ingrained this notion of the kangaroo being just such an important part of Australia. And so, like I said before, I'm not too sure that we would be as defensive of something else, even crocodiles or the American alligators, for instance, that they don't. Are we still opposed to alligator shoes and all that sort of stuff? So I think there's definitely a bit of ownership there. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. In the chat, Kat has sort of talked about emus as well. People don't have an issue with farming emus for oil or meat. I don't know. I think probably there will be plenty of people who do have an issue, but it's certainly, maybe not as heated or as salient in public debate as kangaroo, perhaps. And I suppose there's a difference between farming versus management of wild population too, which adds another interesting dimension to this on top of that. So yeah, some interesting ideas about the way that the symbolism and the cultural adoption plays into this as well. The other thing that I suppose is worth thinking about too is this idea around, competing perspectives, and it not necessarily being as simple as, farmers who are impacted want the populations managed because it's a threat to their livestock versus, basically everyone else who doesn't, kangaroos don't pose an economic threat to, would like to see kangaroos, live freely and without interference. It's not quite as straightforward as that. So I'm interested in some thoughts on the other perspectives on the management of kangaroos as well, and particularly some of the perspectives that are raised in the report.
I think, Jake, I don't think a lot of urban people understand just how many kangaroos are in existence out in the Western areas and that sort of thing. They don't have that perspective. So, from the farming or the massive properties out there, they just don't realise the problems that it does cause.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's sort of a feature or a part of this debate as well is, I suppose, an issue with information and what information people have and how they use that information to inform their perspective too. Absolutely. I'd say that you're right that a lot of people don't understand the scope of the issue, and that informs their view on how it should be managed. Absolutely.
Also, I live in rural and remote areas and have done for some time. Some places are worse than others, but I've had 2 car crashes where I've hit kangaroos at night. And there must be a huge insurance impact on vehicles and that sort of thing that, you don't hit them deliberately. They just jump out from nowhere and they're pretty dangerous. I wiped out the whole front of one car and nearly wrecked the next one as well. And yeah, it's hard to stop too, because you get sort of this death wobble where you've sort of hit the roo and then driven over it with one wheel and then you can't stop the car. So, they're pretty scary. And so I guess it's just another point of view that, there's insurance costs and they can do a lot of damage, and, a lot of people, have accidents, and also a lot of them are killed on the roads as well because they don't have any sense of, stopping if there's a car coming or anything like that. And because they travel in groups as well, you can miss one and then you hit the next one or that sort of thing. It's really difficult to get around at night in rural areas, especially where there's a large population. And the more population there is, you'll see them all along the highways and that sort of thing out west. You can see hundreds of them because, people and trucks have been hitting them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's there's an economic element in that, as you sort of said, around, how it affects insurance and things like that. But there's also, I'd say, an interesting element to the debate around safety in terms of, obviously sort of human safety in terms of preventing road accidents and stuff. And that's an important part of how we think about these things. But also in terms of, I suppose, managing or understanding the way that, humans, I suppose, impose into kangaroo territory and the impact that has as well. And so thinking about how we manage that tension too, absolutely is a further level of complexity here as well. In the chat, I've done it another time. In the chat, Kat has said the wombats on Putty Road is pretty bad as well. Echidnas I rode off 3 tires. So it's, you know, it's certainly not an issue that that it's limited to kangaroos, right? It's a difficult element with, I suppose, you know, human imposition into wild areas, is that, yeah, it's creatures don't know how to deal with these things. They don't necessarily know to recognize a road and what that means and stuff. And so it's you know, I would frame it in terms of the discussions that happened right at the start of this term around, you know, humans' relationship with animals and utilitarianism in particular, and sort of thinking about, you know, how do we balance humans' need for, you know, roads and to be connected and all of those sort of factors with the threat and the cost that comes to wildlife as well. It's, you know, another interesting little balancing act too. I'm conscious that we've gone past 8 o'clock, but we did have a little bit of a later start, so I'm happy to keep things running for a little bit. But equally, you know, I know that you guys have got you know, lives outside the tutorial that you need to get back to as well. So we might just go on for, you know, 2 or 3 more minutes if there's more elements of the discussion to be had, and then we'll wrap up. So yeah, so, you know, a diverse range of ideas and certainly a lot of complex factors that add into the debate. The last thing that I was sort of keen for us to think about was the perspective of First Nations people as well. That was something that the report really focuses on, and you know, it's mentioned sort of first in every list, which I think has its own significance. I was wondering if anyone had any reactions to, yeah, First Nations perspectives on these issues as well. That's cool. I suppose, you know, the key point that's worth thinking about is, for one, the significance that I suppose in generally kangaroos represent to First Nations peoples, but, you know, particular groups and particular nations attach, I suppose, an even greater weight to the kangaroo as a sort of there's references to kangaroos being totemic animals and things like that. And so there's on the one level, there's a really deep importance sort of symbolically or culturally placed on kangaroos. And obviously that weighs in favor of or weighs against culls. But the other thing that's really mentioned too is the sort of the role that kangaroos play ecologically in terms of, you know, there's a mention in the report of you know, using kangaroos to find water sources, and you know, their grazing habits being in themselves useful in bushfire management and things like that. And so there's this sort of sense in the report that there's a level of maybe not necessarily untapped knowledge, but knowledge that can certainly be sort of put to better use in understanding, you know, kangaroos' role in the Australian ecology as well, which I think is an interesting perspective. And then there's some evidentiary debate about whether kangaroo populations have increased or decreased since colonization and that sort of stuff too. But yeah, I think it just adds yet another interesting layer of complexity too, which was interesting. But yeah, unless anyone has any final thoughts or observations on that one, we might wrap up there. So thank you all very much for coming along this evening. Great to talk to you all about, another really complex and thought-provoking issue. But yeah, we'll be back next week. So I'll see you all then. Thanks very much. Bye.